Hello, everyone. We will be starting the webinar in about 2 minutes. Just want to give a little bit of time for other people to sign in. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Tom McDermott, Regional Resource Director for Pennsylvania and Ohio at Caron Treatment Centers. Thank you for joining us for the 11th installment in our webinar series, A View from the Mountain, Caron's Perspective on Addiction Treatment in the Wake of COVID-19, and today's topic, Sobriety, Nutrition, and COVID-19, Practical Ways to Stay Healthy and Sober During a Worldwide Pandemic. Today's presentation is eligible for 1 hour of social work continuing education credit. We would like to thank our educational sponsor, Jumana Grassi, for assisting in obtaining these credits. Please keep your Zoom session open at the end of the presentation to access the post-event evaluation to obtain your 1 hour credit. In order to receive your credit, you must stay on for the duration of the webinar. A certificate will be emailed to you by Jumana within the next 2 weeks. As a reminder, we will be conducting this session in webinar format, which means all participant microphones will be muted. During the presentation, please utilize the Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have. Depending upon the volume of questions we received before the webinar, as well as during, we'll do our best to answer them, and any ones that we cannot get to, we will follow up with you directly. So I'm really excited about today's presentation on nutrition during a pandemic. The last 3.5 months have been very challenging in this world right now and has affected many areas of our lives. One area that has been impacted, and I can definitely speak for myself, is nutrition and how we eat. You know, when things change, it creates anxiety when we're used to doing things in a certain way. A simple time of going to the grocery store, even today, is somewhat challenging. How many people can be in the grocery store as to what aisle you go down has drastically changed. People are in masks, and even seeing shelves that are empty that we're used to having food can create internal anxiety. Quite a few people probably aren't making the healthiest options. They're grabbing what they need and just going home with what they have. Another area that's quite interesting is that fast food restaurants remained open, the drive-thrus remained open during this time. And I can tell you, whenever I would go out, I would see long lines of cars going through the drive-thru. Partly, I believe, because I think it's easy to get food quickly from fast food, but also it brings a little normalcy into our chaotic lives as we're in the midst of a pandemic. Just packing up the kids, the family, and just going through the drive-thru to get a Happy Meal or whatever else, it kind of makes you feel that things are a little normal. All of these things create chaos in our lives, which at times we don't make the healthiest choices. Also, let's not forget that we are home, some of us with kids, husbands, wives, partners, boyfriends, girlfriends, whomever that we're used to not being with all the time and having to prepare 3 meals, and especially with kids snacking throughout the day. So all of these unhealthy nutritional habits are a lot of the things that we deal with at Caron treatment centers when our patients come into treatment. Living in the world of chaos in the midst of our addiction, probably not eating as healthy as we could. Caron is really fortunate to have a food service company, which is Sodexo. Sodexo does an amazing job with the food choices that they present to our clients each day, healthy, vegan, as well as vegetarian. Also, I can tell you that in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, Sodexo has done an outstanding job of keeping the cafeterias clean, keeping the food fresh, and even making sure that the food coming in from the outside has been handled properly. Also on the Sodexo staff that is part of the Caron family are 2 licensed dietitians that work side by side with our clinical staff, our medical staff, as well as our psychological staff. So whatever medical dietary needs coming into treatment are met. So I would like to introduce Stephanie Arnold, clinical nutrition manager, as well as Jess Achenbach, who's a clinician dietitian. They make sure that any medical dietary needs are met. And I should also mention that they help with our kosher meals for our Jewish patients. Caron is able to meet the needs of our kosher patients coming in. So having said all of that, I would like to introduce Stephanie and Jess.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Steph. I'm, like Tom said, the clinical nutrition manager at Caron. So Jessica and I are really excited to present this topic to you today as we social distance from our offices here, or Jessica's office at Caron Warnersville. This is actually the second time we're presenting this topic, and for the first time nationally. So we're grateful that Tom and Caitlin invited us back for a second time. We want to thank you both for your support. And just to mention before we get started, so many people are still spending time at home while some others are transitioning back to work. And it's important with that transition to keep healthy habits in mind. As Tom mentioned, we will have some time for questions at the end. And I know there were some submitted through the registration process, so we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can, and ones that come in during today's presentation. And if we want to now poll the audience to see what your lunch plans are for today. So rank your lunch plans for today. All right, and do we have poll results? Not seeing any on my end. Okay, well, hopefully we can take a look back at those poll results a little bit later. If we could just move on to the next slide for time purposes today, and we'll take a look at today's outline. All right, so here's today's outline for the presentation. Jessica is going to start us off with discussing food planning, shopping, storing, and preparation. And I'm going to pick back up later and discuss food and immunity, supplements, food and well-being, and healthy coping mechanisms. Much of the information in the beginning of today's presentation is more generalized than recovery specific and can be applied to really anyone during this time. I think it's important to remember the food aspect of being a dietitian, although, like Tom mentioned, much of what Jessica and I do here at Caron is heavy on the clinical side. We are also very involved in the processes and protocols in the dining room. And much of the recovery aspect of being a dietitian, involves, nutrition starts with the information Jessica is going to discuss. So when working with patients with special dietary needs here at Caron, we are in constant communication with Sodexo Dining Services to successfully be able to meet the individual needs of our patients here. Next slide, please. All right, so as I mentioned, you can receive credit. So at the conclusion of today's presentation, you should be able to identify 2 effective means of food planning, list 3 ways to safely food shop during social isolation, name 3 immune boosting nutrients, list 3 ingredients that can alter your mood, and finally list 4 healthy means of coping when experiencing distress. All right, Jess is going to take it away with the food planning.
Hello everyone, I'm Jess Achenbach. Like Steph said, I'm the other dietitian here, and I'll take us through the food planning meal prep portion of this presentation. So one easy thing that you can do before you do anything else is take an inventory of the items in your home. Go through the cabinets, dig through the freezers. I know I did that recently and discovered frozen vegetables I didn't know I had. So just try to really thoroughly go through what you have in your house already so you know what you do and do not need. Try to be creative with the items that you do already have on hand. So a lot of times what I'll do when I'm planning my grocery list for the week, I will look at what I have and try to combine it with a recipe that I know I want to make. So if we have a lot of pasta or beans, we try to incorporate that into the dishes that we're doing that week. Try to create a menu for at least a week or 2 so you don't have to go to the grocery store multiple times in 1 week. And even if you can, double some of your recipes and freeze them for later so you have backups when you either can't make it to the grocery store or don't feel like cooking on a particular night, which I don't blame you. Things like soups, stews, casseroles, anything like that is great. I know right now I have a cream of broccoli soup in the freezer, which actually I'm kind of hungry for, so maybe I'll thaw that out later. Easy things like that are great to have on hand so that you don't have to be scrambling last minute all the time to plan your meals. And then once you kind of have a survey of what you already have in your house, that's when you can start to identify the foods that need to be purchased. What I do in my house that can be very helpful is I have a dry erase board with magnets on it on the side of my fridge. And as I come across things that we're running low on, my husband and I will write them on the list so that we know we will need to get them the next time we go to the grocery store. So if we use the last of our eggs one morning, we'll write eggs on the list or whatever we realize we need, as well as anything we need for a specific recipe. So if you have a recipe in front of you, you can use the dry erase board to write out the ingredients you will need for that specific recipe. And then this I did before the pandemic, but it's even more beneficial now. Try to formulate your list based on the store layout. So depending on how your grocery store is set up right now, and if there's one-way rows and aisles, try to write your grocery list the way the store is being operated. So that's what's nice about the dry erase board is you have a rough list, and then you can hand write a specific list based on the store layout. So for example, I tend to shop at Aldi a lot, so I know that the produce is first, then the bread, eggs, milk and yogurt, back and forth. So I will specifically write my list based on how I know the store is laid out. Next slide, please. Okay. When you are food planning, it's nice to have some shelf-stable and frozen foods on hand, so you have them as a backup, kind of like I mentioned in the beginning. If you have these things on hand, it'll make meal planning a little bit easier. It's great to have dried or canned beans, peas, and lentils as a vegetarian protein source, especially with a lot of the meat plants in the country being affected right now by COVID. Having some more vegetarian dishes on hand is going to be beneficial. Try to have canned vegetables with no added salt, just to be mindful of the sodium content. Dried or canned fruit in 100% juice, just because heavy syrup is going to add a lot of sugar. So having the dry or canned fruit is nice as a backup, especially with kids. I know usually canned fruit is an easy go-to for a snack. Whole grains, try to get whole wheat bread, brown rice, quinoa, whole wheat pasta. You can even buy an extra loaf of bread and keep it in the freezer if you don't mind throwing it in the toaster then. So then you have some backup bread, so you don't have to go to the store as much for bread. trying to have some pouches or cans of fish and chicken, another easy source of protein. Just the other day, my husband was complaining there was nothing to eat, opened up the cabinet, oh, hey, there's tuna. So he made tuna salad. So having those backups is really nice when you're in a pinch. Nuts, seeds, and nut butter, so peanut butter, almond butter, anything like that is a nice, easy source of protein to add when you're making snacks or meals. My daughter pretty much lives on peanut butter right now, so it's always nice to have extra of peanut butter in the house. Olive oil and canola oil are great sources of healthy fats for cooking, so having them on hand. And then dried herbs and spices are going to last longer, so it's nice to have a stockpile of those. I actually discovered recently they're starting to make spices that are like partially fresh but then dried, so they last a little bit longer. So if you prefer fresh, those options are available. And I've even discovered things like ginger and garlic paste at certain grocery stores, so those are a nice backup to have if you don't have fresh garlic or ginger for a recipe. Some frozen foods to have on hand, lots of veggies, fruits. Whole wheat pizza dough is nice to have because on a Friday night, your family could do a pizza dinner where you make it yourself and throw lots of veggies or healthy proteins on the pizza. Poultry, so having some frozen chicken on hand as a backup for meals, and frozen seafood like salmon, tilapia, shrimp are always great. Some people are wary of frozen foods because they feel like they're not as healthy as fresh, but most of the time, frozen foods are frozen at their peak ripeness, especially fruits and veggies. So they tend to have just as many nutrients as fresh. So they're actually a really nice backup to kind of keep the fruits and veggies in your house on hand a little bit longer without having to worry about them going bad. Next slide, please. Okay, so to minimize the time spent in the grocery store, please don't leave your home without your plan and your list. So I feel like that kind of helps ease the anxiety that Tom was talking about. If you know exactly what you want to buy and it's in the order of how you're going to walk through the grocery store, it kind of helps calm you down so you're not in panicked mode, because I know the grocery stores can be overwhelming right now because of everything going on and the masks and all the rules. So if you have your plan in place, it can kind of help keep you calm and make the shopping experience a little bit more pleasurable. Make sure you wash and sanitize your hands prior to entering the grocery store. I actually keep a thing of hand sanitizer in the little pocket in the door of my car. So I kind of pump a couple squeezes, rub it on as I'm walking in. And I do the same thing when I get back to the car. Use sanitizing wipes to sanitize your cart or basket. I've noticed most places have the sanitizing wipes there for you, but if you feel more comfortable, you could always bring them with. Try to shop the shelf-stable foods first if the layout of the grocery stores allows you to, and try to pay attention to use by and sell by dates, trying to buy the latest date in the future that you can, just so your products last longer. And also be mindful of not purchasing bruised or damaged items because they're going to spoil more quickly. And that's going to be problematic if you're trying to make your grocery run last a week or 2 weeks. And minimizing hand contact, try to avoid self-checkout as much as you can, because if you think about it, multiple people are going through and using that throughout the day, whereas the regular checkout, it's just that same person. Granted, I have seen them wiping down the self-checkouts, but it can be a little sketchy just because there's a higher traffic volume of people touching all the different areas of the self-checkout. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you get home, the key is going to be storing your perishable items first, so anything that needs to be refrigerated, and being mindful to keep the raw meats, fish, and poultry away from the ready-to-eat foods. That is a foodborne illness thing that we teach here and practice as well, so making sure that the raw meats and fish are below fruits and vegetables, because if the raw meat or fish were to drip onto a ready-to-eat food like an apple, carrot, there's a higher risk of foodborne illness because you're not cooking it off. So things like salmonella, all of that, that's what we're trying to prevent by storing your food in the fridge in a particular way. Then you can sanitize and store the non-perishable items last. I know some people feel comfortable wiping everything down before they put it away. There's not a lot of evidence showing that COVID-19 is being transmitted through the food or food packaging. It's mainly through human contact, the droplets that we express through our mouth and nose. But if you feel more comfortable wiping things down, that's totally up to you and your comfort level. I've had people who will keep the non-perishable items like cereal, crackers, that sort of thing in the garage or somewhere else outside of the kitchen for a little bit, just to kind of let things settle, and then they'll bring it into the house in a day or two just to lower that risk of anything being on the packaging. Try to wash all your produce prior to consumption, because then it's one less thing that you have to worry about. I know some people will wash all the produce right when they bring it home just so it's ready to go. Okay, next slide, please. This is just a nice infographic showing which fruits and veggies are better to refrigerate versus not refrigerate. One thing I like to point out is with avocados, depending on when you buy them, if they're really, really hard, it's great to keep them out so they start to ripen. But what sometimes I'll do is move the avocados to the fridge once they start to ripen, just to make them last a little bit longer. But overall, this is just a nice picture of what foods like peaches, bananas, tomato, watermelon, they can stay out of the fridge, whereas most other fruits and veggies need to be in the fridge. Next slide, please. Okay, so with food prep, making sure that you use the oldest items first. So first in, first out. What I tend to do, if I can, when I'm putting my groceries away, is I look at those sell by and use by dates and try to arrange the foods in that way so that I'm using the oldest stuff first. So if I bring home a couple of the prepackaged yogurts, Greek yogurts, I'll put the newest ones in the back and the oldest ones in the front. So I automatically eat the oldest ones first. Make sure before food prep, you wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. Wash any produce if you hadn't done it when you brought it home. And making sure you cook foods according to the directions, especially with meat. You want to cook meat to the proper internal temperature to prevent foodborne illness. A good example is poultry chicken. It needs to be at least 165 to cut down the risk of foodborne illness. Next slide, please. Okay, and another thing I like to emphasize is trying to get the kids involved in meal prep as much as you can. It builds healthy habits that they'll sustain throughout their life, and it makes it a more fun family thing. Just last night, I pulled up my little stool so that my daughter, she's 18 months, could watch my husband chop the vegetables. Granted, we did not let her use the knife. Please don't worry. She was just there to observe, but just having her watch, she was like into it. And then I even had a little play fork that she was poking at the onions as he was cooking them. So just little things like that to just get the kids involved. And then depending on how old they are, you can start to assign them tasks that they can do on their own. Younger kids, they could help set the table, pour the drinks, anything to do with their hands that they don't need to use a knife, like tearing lettuce, that sort of thing. And then as the kids get older, you can start to introduce various skills like cooking on the stovetop, cutting. The older kids can help read the recipe, practice their reading skills. So it's a nice way to have the whole family involved. And I know certain families do like Taco Tuesday or Pizza Friday. So having those traditions can help build the bond with the family and build a healthy relationship around food as well. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Steph, and she's going to start talking about food and immunity.
All right, I'm back, everybody. Thanks, Jess, for the great information, on the food planning, shopping, storing, and preparation. A lot to think about, and as we transition back to some sort of normalcy, I'm sure things are going to change, as we move forward. So I'm going to change gears a bit now and discuss food and immunity, like Jess mentioned. As most of you are already aware, many nutrients do help boost our immune system, vitamin C being the most common. Other immune boosting nutrients are listed on this slide, and they include protein, vitamin A, vitamin E, zinc, probiotics, and beta carotene. Before we take a look at food sources of these nutrients on the next slide, I want to emphasize two things. First, there is no single nutrient or food that can prevent illness. And secondly, these nutrients work best when coming from our most natural source of them being food. So many nutrients have more than one function, and many of them work synergistically or together with one another. So it is essential we try to consume these nutrients through food rather than through supplements. Also, some of these nutrients, such as vitamin A, vitamin E, and zinc, reach toxic levels in our bodies, and it is much more common for toxicity to happen from a supplement than from food. So when using food to boost immunity, it is also best to consume these foods consistently rather than loading up, like starting when we start to feel sick. So instead of just taking a lot of vitamin C or getting a lot of vitamin C foods in when we feel a cold coming on, we say, like, you have very expensive urine, or vitamin C, because your body, any water soluble nutrient is going to be excreted naturally. Your body's only going to absorb so much, and then we excrete the rest naturally through our urine and other ways that we rid toxins from the body. Next slide, please. All right, so listed on this slide are food sources of the immune boosting nutrients that were on the previous slide. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read through each bullet point. However, I do want to say that most foods do contain more than one nutrient, such as leafy greens. You'll see them listed a couple times on this slide. So that would be like your kale, your spinach, your romaine, your leaf lettuce. And because nutrients have more than one function, like I previously mentioned, it is recommended to vary your food choices even within the food group. So with regards to fruits and vegetables, different colors contain different nutrients. So Jess and I always tell patients, color your plate like the rainbow when it comes to fruits and vegetables. That way you're getting, a good variety, or you're maximizing your nutrient intake, we say. Also, the term probiotics have a lot of hype today, or the term probiotic has a lot of hype today. Probiotics contribute to healthy gut bacteria. And, we know that we have healthy and unhealthy bacteria that lines our gastrointestinal tract. And there's a lot of research currently on how our gut bacteria can actually influence just not our overall physical health, but our mental and emotional well-being as well. And so scientists are finding that the healthier our gut bacteria is, the healthier we are overall. So this is really interesting stuff, especially with regards to substance addiction and commonly co-occurring mental disorders. So does this mean if someone in recovery suffers from depression, which could be a relapse trigger, they could possibly have better control of symptoms with food in conjunction with medication? And preliminary research is actually telling us this is the case. And this is the exact reason Jessica and I are so passionate as behavioral health dietitians here at Caron, specializing in addiction, because the research is really growing, especially over the last decade. And it's really fascinating to watch and share with our patients as well as other clinicians here on campus. Next slide, please. All right, so I hope all of us are aware that at this point there's no cure for COVID-19, and scientists are working overtime to develop a vaccine, and there's really a good chance that total normalcy, or what we've known as normal up until this point, will not occur until a vaccine is created. So in the meantime, there's a good chance that food companies and supplement companies are going to try to take advantage of consumers by making claims about their products in relation to COVID-19. They may even try to advertise their product as being able to diagnose, treat, or even cure COVID-19, and even foods that have vitamin C naturally. So citrus foods, we know most commonly associated with their vitamin C content. We might see things in the grocery store now, like contain vitamin C, the immune boosting nutrient. So, we just have to be mindful of that. The Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, is closely monitoring and warning such companies. And aside from this, it's also important to recognize that the FDA does not regulate supplements. So there is no guarantee we actually are getting what a supplement is telling us we are getting on the label. And this can be really scary. There is, however, an agency called the United States Pharmacopoeia, or USP, and this agency does provide some regulations. So when purchasing supplements on your own, it's best to stick to brands that are USP certified. Some examples being Nature Made, Kirkland Signature, that's spelled with a K, and True Nature, TRU, Nature, one word. And depending on the location and stores you have available, you might find some of these and not others. It just depends on the place where you're making these purchases. Again, I just want to emphasize, though, it's really important, if you can, to stick to foods. It's one thing if you are told by a physician, or some other healthcare professional that you're nutrient deficient and you need supplementation, and it's another if you can, get this nutrition from food. That's really your best bet and your most effective means of getting the nutrients. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're gonna switch gears a little bit more. So we talked about food and immunity, and talking about food and well-being. And so again, as behavioral health dietitians, Jessica and I emphasize to patients in recovery, food is so much more than just nourishment, physical nourishment for our body. So society leaves us to believe food is just that. So simple, right? Like we eat too much, we gain weight. We want to lose weight, so we cut back on food intake, and voila, we lose weight. It's that easy. Does everyone agree? Of course, it's not that easy. And of course, it impacts more than our physical wellness. So research tells us mood stability is essential for someone in recovery, and what helps with a consistent mood is consistent food intake. So this is meals and snacks throughout the day. No diet of any kind, or no limiting or excluding of food groups is encouraged. Nutrients exist for a reason and are meant to be consumed to enhance our health and wellness. So you can see on this slide the acronym HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, tired, and the newer term hangry, or anger stemming from being hungry, remind us that food has everything to do with our mood. When we improperly nourish our bodies, it can influence our mood, self-esteem, and self-worth, and lead to unwanted weight gain. All of these can be triggers to pick up or drink a drink or a drug. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to discuss a little bit about three ingredients here that engage the reward pathway in the brain and lead to mood instability. So sugar, fat, and caffeine. Sugar releases dopamine from the brain, and we know that substances also release dopamine from the brain. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It makes us feel good. And so when it's good in small amounts, it's not good in excessive amounts. And our bodies can get used to that dopamine being released. And in early recovery, we often talk about a dopamine deficiency. So because someone's not using, they're experiencing a dopamine deficiency in the brain. This leads to sugar cravings, and overconsumption of sugar can lead to mood instability and also weight gain. Both of which can be relapse triggers. Secondly, fat. Fat is an essential nutrient. However, excessive amounts of unhealthy fats, or saturated and or trans fat, can lead us feeling overly satiated, so overly full, tired, and groggy. Excessive fat can also lead to unwanted weight gain. We know that fat is the most calorically dense nutrient. So when we talk about nutrients that give our body, nutrients that give our body calories, fat, protein, and carbohydrates are the three macronutrients that give us calories. Vitamins and minerals we need, but they do not provide our bodies with calories. Carbohydrates and protein give us 4 calories per gram. Fat gives us 9. So that's a good reference for you, that it's very concentrated. That's why foods high in fat are higher in calories. And no matter if it's a healthy fat or an unhealthy fat. So we just have to be mindful of where our sources of fat is coming from, and how, like, if we're getting too much or not, that can potentially lead to the weight gain. Lastly, caffeine is naturally found, as most of you are aware, in coffee, tea, chocolate, soda, and energy drinks. Caffeine also releases dopamine from the brain. So excessive amounts can lead to mood instability and highs and lows in terms of energy. The recommendation for recovery is no more than 400 milligrams a day, or about 4 6-ounce cups of coffee. And this is really no different than the typical recommendation. We always say we really don't want to limit any of these, or we don't want to eliminate any of these things. We just want patients to understand, and individuals to understand, how these 3 ingredients can potentially alter our mood. And maybe in one case where we would say, okay, let's try to take out the sugar or the fat if someone has an eating disorder, and they're struggling with any of these ingredients in excess, and feeling like their behaviors surrounding these ingredients are actually very similar to their behaviors surrounding substances. So it's that, 1 is too many, 1,000 is never enough. If a patient is, or if they're hiding food, or feeling guilty or shameful after eating any of these ingredients, that could potentially be an indication of an eating disorder. And Jess or I might say, okay, let's take out the sugar for a little bit, kind of get the brain and the body back to baseline, and we'll gradually add it in. But we would typically call these foods like trigger foods. It's a perfect combination, and like what our body needs to feel good, mentally. Next slide, please. All right, and what does the research suggest with food and well-being? So, keeping in mind the reward pathway and the body's desire to feel good, this first study that we looked at finds binge eating behavior in socially isolated female mice. I think it's interesting how they're female. The conclusion was social isolation can lead to depression, and depression leads to an increase in eating behavior to achieve dopamine response in the brain. Makes sense, right? The second study finds consistent evidence linking social isolation and loneliness to worse cardiovascular and mental health outcomes. So, just in terms of recovery, if we look at triggers for relapse, oftentimes it's isolation. It's isolating, and it oftentimes leads to these undesirable thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and then turning to a drink or a drug. So it's very important to keep in mind that there is evidence out there, and many of you are probably already aware of the the isolation that occurs in active addiction. I'm sure there's going to be much more research to be revealed just after this pandemic is done, and what basically the ramifications are of this time, and humans, and we like to be together. And on the next slide is a direct quote here, and I'll just read this quote, that humans require the experience of inclusion and connectedness with others in much the same way they require food and drink, sleep, shelter, and safety. In addition, the same active system that serves other basic needs also serves the need to belong. When we feel connected to others, we experience positive emotions such as happiness. When our needs are thwarted, we feel negative emotions such as anxiety, sadness, and jealousy. We therefore strive to maintain a sense of connection and fulfill this basic need. Next slide, please. All right, and what does the research suggest? I looked a little bit about, or Jessica and I looked a little bit about, how does having children affect adults' eating behavior, especially during this time, like Jessica was talking about, Tom was talking about, there are kids in the home. Many of us might find that we're eating what they're eating. There was actually very little research available on how, children's behaviors influence adult eating behaviors. There was actually very much of the opposite, like how adults, eating behaviors can influence a child's eating behaviors through that modeling. Jessica and I kind of talked about what this might be, if we're more apt to eat children's food during this time. If we think about it, it may have to do with the types of food they're consuming, often highly palatable, stimulating the reward circuit in the brain, leading to the dopamine release that I talked about a couple slides ago. Also, it may have to do with parents' opinions of food waste and not wanting to waste food. So, they feel like they're finding themselves cleaning up after their children. When they're done eating, they eat their food, instead of making their own. So try to keep in mind, I get sometimes there's like, this is really, really difficult, but try to put yourself first and your health first, recognizing your own triggers as well as trying to prevent as much food waste as possible. Next slide, please. All right, and we will end with the most difficult aspect of all of this. So what should I do when I am feeling discontented and know that I am not hungry? So there are many memes out there having to do with today's pandemic. And I think the one that sticks with me most through all of this says that I think I'm getting a tan from the light bulb in my refrigerator. And so just going to the refrigerator out of boredom or just, not feeling like that normalcy, just really, really not having the normalcy really, really throws us. And while some of us might be getting used to that, or some of us are in transition back to some normalcy, here are some healthy coping mechanisms that can help whenever we're feeling, any feelings of discomfort. I'm not going to read through them. I just put some up here on the slide. Some may work for some individuals, some may not work. It's just about trying what works for you and recognizing, if you do try something like journaling and it's not for you, that's okay. Also, if you tend to enjoy one or many of these things typically in normalcy and you're finding yourself not enjoying them in this time of distress, don't beat yourself up. Try something else. It often makes it worse and leads to feelings of guilt and shame, which can then jeopardize recovery if we're too hard on ourselves. So trying new things if things that, typically work for you are not working during this time. All right, next slide, please. All right. And I'm going to do the poll results quickly. Or go over them here. So it looks like most of you, 57% of you today are eating a healthy, well-balanced lunch, and 38% are having lunch. It could be healthier, and 5% are not eating. So I feel like those are pretty good percentages. So thank you everyone for participating in the poll today. Jessica and I are going to now tag team some questions, and I know because we're practicing social distancing, you can't really see Jessica. She's kind of in the background, so we're going to do our best to answer these, and you might hear her out of the background, or we might switch seats depending on the question. So what I'd like to start with today, I'll just read the question. These were the questions that came in during the registration process, and it looks like we have about 15 or so minutes, which I'm really happy about, because we want to answer your questions that definitely take time to answer questions that you put in here. So The first question, are there foods which increase resistance to COVID-19 or other viruses? So to date, there is no research that I am aware of that foods really do, protect us against any viruses, all right? What does is a healthy immune system. And of course, genetics play a role as well. So where some of us are immunocompromised, if someone has, type 1 diabetes, or cardiovascular disease or some kind of lung issue, we know that those are going to compromise the immune system. So really, those immune boosting nutrients that I discussed and taking a look back at those slides of foods would certainly help with the immune system. And then to keep in mind anything else that could be compromising the immune system. Jess, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
That's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question, how can one subdue cravings for carbohydrates? So the most important thing that someone can do to not have food cravings in general is to be liberal with your food intake. Okay, so like you heard me say, much in recovery, we really don't, there's an old school, no white flour, white sugar diet, because that can trigger the reward pathway and lead to dopamine release in the brain. And so there was some research on okay, so anything triggering the reward pathway with regards to food can be considered addictive. And the newer research is not indicating that. So the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics puts out guidelines for sobriety nutrition therapy, which is the fancy term for nutrition and recovery. Really, well-balanced eating. So making sure we're actually getting in complex carbohydrates. So complex carbohydrates are found in whole, grains. So pasta, breads, rice, trying to choose whole grains when we can versus refined grains. So refined grains are going to have some of the nutrients taken out. Basically, the more wholesome a food is, the more nutrient dense it's going to be. And also the slower our body is going to take in digesting that food. So it's going to, not result in, a surge of energy or blood glucose and a decrease. It's kind of going to give us this flat line of energy. And also along with that, mood stability. So to answer that question, I would say really to include them, because what we find is people who eliminate carbohydrates from their diet or they limit them, they do crave them. And that's the body's way. I mean, all of our cells in our body, not just our muscle cells, our brain cells, our bone cells, all of our cells use glucose for energy, and we most readily get glucose from carbohydrates. So really, really important and most manageable way to decrease your cravings is to eat them in moderation. Jess, anything on that?
No, I agree. I was just going to say, when you try to eliminate a food group, it almost makes it more desirable. So a lot of times when people try to cut out carbs, quote unquote, it actually ends up making them want to overeat it more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in terms of recovery too, I'm glad Jess said that, because it kind of creates this all or nothing, this black or white dichotomous way of thinking with food. And when we set such strict boundaries with food, i.e. diets of any kind, that kind of sets us up for permission to fail. So we oftentimes talk about that with patients, addiction is black and white. It's dichotomous. It's all or nothing. It's 0 to 60. And with food, we really want to create this scenario of it's very tricky, but we want to create this gray area where it's all about balance. And if patients are struggling with that, that's where we can kind of come in and take a look at specifically what someone is eating and make recommendations based on, their current intake. So I think that answers that question. Do you recommend, the next question is, do you recommend any specific weight loss plans? We don't. We actually really discourage any kind of weight loss in early recovery. And that is because of the research that tells us eating disorders are individuals who suffer from substance addiction are at a higher risk of suffering from an eating disorder. And these really go hand in hand. So we really find in early recovery, again, if we're focusing on calories, numbers of any kind, really, it really does set someone up to fail. So we do general meal planning guidelines. With general meal planning guidelines and simple tools for portion control, such as the Choose My Plate image, which is from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics website, we have patients that are able to safely monitor their intake. And if their desired goal, like to get healthy, is weight loss, say someone's overweight, okay, so they can use the general meal planning guidelines and get there. We encourage not focusing, or we discourage focusing on numbers of any kind. That goes with eating and exercise. So not paying attention to calories. We don't give meal plans that are calorie specific. With physical activity, we discourage really focusing on duration of physical activity, distance gone, any of those calories burned, because again, it creates this fixation. And we very much see that, then one addiction can turn into something else, or like we say, the disease of addiction can manifest in different ways. So it can transfer very easily to something else, and that's what we don't want. Anyway, it's like someone who, like a dry drunk, like someone who's not actively drinking, but they're already like in that relapse process. So anyway, no specific weight loss plans at all. The next question is, how can we help clients activate self-discipline with their eating habits when they are despondent or depressed? And so this is a really good question. I think this question really speaks to the multidisciplinary team that we have here on campus. And I'll be the first to say, as a dietitian, we are not mental health experts, and that's what we have psychologists and psychiatrists for. So I think getting, someone's mental health under control, first with medication and having an evaluation with a psychologist or a psychiatrist on campus, and then the food stuff is going to come first. But we want to, see if medication will be effective with any kind of co-occurring mental illness. Jess, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, until the person's mood stabilizes, it's going to be hard for them to focus on anything. So I really think that's key.
All right. Next question is, how can we engage children with sensory issues? So we kind of talked about this question, Jessica and I, before today's webinar. And again, first to say, like any professional will say, like, this is not my domain. And really where, food is our domain. And we can involve children with sensory issues in the food preparation process, or children with sensory issues may have issues with helping to prepare. So again, this is going to be more of like a speech pathologist or talking with your physician, your primary care physician, about what services would be available to children with sensory issues. I know like textures of food, whether it's feel, whether it's taste, can be an issue. And again, where dietitians are very much the food experts, as far as sensory stuff goes, that's kind of out of our realm of practice. So, better kind of like the mental illness, better to get that stabilized first and have someone who directly deals with that. Same thing with children with sensory issues. It's very challenging, especially during these times. And so reaching out to the primary care physician who can give you resources to help with that initially, and then maybe bringing a dietitian in later, to talk about that. Jess, is there anything you want to add on that?
No.
Okay. Flying right along here.
Steph,
yeah.
I'm gonna ask a couple of really quick questions that came in live, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
So what's the difference between pre and probiotic?
Okay, that's a good question. Probiotics, like I mentioned, are actually the healthy gut bacteria that line our gastrointestinal tract. Prebiotics are food for probiotics. So prebiotics serve the probiotics. And so if we don't have prebiotics in our diet, probiotics are going to have a very hard time surviving or flourishing in our gut. And to answer that a little bit further, prebiotics are found in mostly fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. So as long as we're consuming a well-balanced diet, we can also get probiotics through those fermented foods. So we can actually get both through foods, but prebiotics are food, what the probiotics feed on. So both are very, very important in our diet and in our health.
Awesome. So one more real quick, then I'll let you get back to the list. What's the best way to thaw frozen meat quickly?
Okay, frozen meat quickly. That's a tough one.
Under running water.
Yeah, so to safely thaw it, under cold running water, it is something that we actually, is food safety approved here at Caron, which we do. You can thaw it in the microwave depending how you're going to, if that's probably the quickest way, honestly. However, depending how you're preparing it, it can create a rubbery, dry product. So you just want to make sure if you are thawing it in the microwave that you're choosing the right weight of the item that you're thawing, so that you're not cooking it in the microwave or trying your best not to. So running water, and then I would say microwave. Running water is probably best for quality. For time, it would probably be the microwave.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll let you get back to your list.
Okay. Did you have anything to add before we move on? Okay. So the next question was, what tips do you have to help a client who is in long-term recovery and also obese? So again, this would be more so focusing on general meal planning guidelines, in portions, using visual aids such as the Choose My Plate image. And that is, you can Google it, the Choose My Plate image. It's basically what took the place of the food guide pyramid, I believe, in 2011. So it's been around for quite some time. And it's basically a dinner plate, and it references the food groups and what portions they should look like on our plate. So like grains and protein should be no more than a quarter of our plate, as well as fruits and vegetables. And fruits and vegetables should be half the plate, grains and protein the other half, and then dairy is kind of represented off to the side. We can be a little bit more lenient with fruits and vegetables. Grains and protein, are going to be more calorically dense most of the time, so we have to be more mindful of that. So again, really, there's no diet recommended in any point in recovery. It's all about consistency with eating, paying attention to portions, and just focusing on the general guidelines with food and physical activity. Again, physical activity also doesn't have to be going to a gym. If you have animals at home, you like to walk the dog, you like to go for a walk, that is perfect, and more than sufficient for health, for not just physical health, mental and emotional health as well. So again, trying not to do a diet and trying to focus on just those general guidelines is what's encouraged. Jess, anything to add?
I was going to share some books I have on my desk.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello. And I'm back. So to add to what Steph and I've been in the corner adding, there's a couple of books I think that would hit a lot of these questions. It seems like our culture is really focused on weight, and a lot of research is finding the more you focus on weight, you tend to do unhealthy things to manipulate your weight. So some books I wanted to just share with everyone really quickly is this. It's called Body Kindness. So it's about focusing on health and wellness without overly focusing on weight. So what gets people in trouble is they don't see the results they want in the time they want, so they start to do things like restricting or over-exercising, whereas Body Kindness is focusing on accepting your body where it is, and then trying to implement healthy behaviors because you love and accept your body. Because I think sometimes healthy eating and exercise is almost like a punishment for the body in certain people, depending on their mindset, and then it's not going to be sustainable. The other book I wanted to share is Intuitive Eating. We use this a lot with our patients. So it's the theory that eating when we're hungry, stopping when we're satisfied, not eating to the point of being overly full, and trying to identify when you're eating for reasons other than hunger. Because then with the question with obesity, maybe the individual is eating to self-soothe for some reason. So instead of focusing on the diet and exercise portion, focusing on the emotional reason why they may be overeating. So these are those two. Okay, back to Steph.
All right. I can't hear.
We can't hear you,
We
Tom.
can't hear you, Tom.
Whoops, let's try that again. Sorry about that. This is actually for all the single people. So what recommendations for those that are single and shop and cook for themselves?
Okay, it's a good one. And we get this question a lot when we're meeting with patients here at Caron. So one thing with perishable foods, so our fruits and our vegetables, that Jessica and I often recommend is, you know, I know they have like a lot of grab and go things in convenience stores and grocery stores today. One thing at the grocery store that might not be an option right now, which makes it a little bit tougher, you might have to go more for those prepackaged items, like going to the salad bar, you know, and just grabbing like a handful of broccoli. Like if you want to make a stir fry, like a chicken stir fry, going with like a handful of broccoli, carrots, onions, you know, snow peas or whatever, rather than buying a whole head of broccoli or, you know, a whole bag of carrots, because it typically goes bad before we can consume it. So, and as far as meats go and things, you know, just trying to see what's on sale in the grocery store and, you know, choose one or two, you know, or just one for the week, freeze the other one, you know, as far as dairy products, you know, and like eggs and things, if you go organic, oftentimes the dates will be a little bit longer out, and not that we need to nutritionally, but they might last a little bit longer.
Thank you very much, Steph and Jess. I really appreciate your insightful webinar and tips and everything. I really appreciate it. So thanks to all our participants attending today's webinar. Jessica and Stephanie have provided us with 2 healthy recipes and items you might already have in your pantry, and we will include them on the email that we send out later, as well as the answer to all of the unanswered questions. As a reminder, we are offering continuing education credits for social workers. A survey will be posted for you to take immediately following this presentation in order to obtain credits. Again, you must be on for the entire duration of the presentation in order to get credit. You will receive a certificate of completion in the next couple of weeks. As a reminder, next Tuesday marks a transition into our weekly webinars. For the next 3 weeks, we are starting a series called Focusing on Family Systems, How Caron Stays Connected to Families in Non-Traditional Ways. During these series, we will take a closer look at how Caron has continued to engage families in the treatment process during the COVID-19 pandemic. We will explore how our family education programs have changed, as well as take a deeper look at how siblings and children have been affected. Lastly, we will provide a webinar with some great tips for parents. Please watch your email for additional information and to register as we begin this exciting new series. Also, as a reminder, please reach out to your local regional resource directors for any additional information or questions. Again, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon. And remember, eat something healthy today. Thank you. Take care and be safe.